Hello. It's been a while. Yeah, sorry. I've had a lot going on. Um, Beyond this channel, I'm also advising a lot of people in person, and that takes a lot out of me and doesn't leave a lot of room for this channel. But I need to start treating this a little more seriously. So I made a video. It was one of the first ones I ever did, called "How to Hear the Voice of God." I'm very proud of that video. I think it's very good, and I hope it helps someone. But there is a problem with it. And that problem became clear to me today. I've been discussing with one of my brothers. He has been struggling to understand God's will for him and how to clearly hear the voice of God, right? He says that God is speaking to him. And I never took him seriously. Um like really, because he'd be like, "Oh, God is telling me this, God is telling me that," right? And I made the mistake of not taking him super seriously, right? And I kept advocating for my method of spending time in silence, and, paying attention to your inner self, right? And while I stand by that, by the way, I think that is very good, and that's what's worked for me. But I need to make an important caveat here, okay? And this applies to anything I say on this channel, all right? Anything and everything. Do not take what I say to be gospel truth, okay? I worry in my first video that I gave the impression that this is the only way to hear God. This guy that I was talking with proves that I am wrong. And there's other stuff, we'll get into that, right? But I need to make the disclaimer that when I speak about things on this channel, it is things that I have tried in my own life, that I've applied in my own life, right? That have worked for me personally, but that does not mean it will work for everyone, okay? I made the very hubristic mistake of thinking that it wasn't possible for God to speak to someone in more than one way. So, for this guy who I've been talking with, right, he has these more visceral conversations with God, right? They're more vivid, I would say, almost like biblical visions, right? And I sort of poo pooed that idea because I've never had that. Anytime God has spoken to me, right, it's always been subtle, easy to miss, right? I can't think of a single time. Well, that's not true. There have been a few times in my life where the message is very apparent, right? But in most cases, it is based in subtlety, right? Because that's the only experience that I ever had. Shift the camera a little bit. I got this better. Since that is the only experience I've ever had, I did not give credit to the experience others have had, right? That was hubristic. And I had that realization because Malik D. Lewis of Purpose Driven did a live stream today, and he said something very interesting. He was like, "Who are you to put God in a box? He's God." And I just sat there and I realized I put God in a box. I thought the only way that he spoke, right, was through subtle messages, right? So where did I get this idea, right? This idea came largely from Jordan B. Peterson. If you don't know who he is a famous psychologist. He's written many, many books. He's pretty well known. I recommend you look him up. He's got some very good stuff. but he has these religious notions, right? I don't agree with everything he says religiously. He seems to view the Bible as a set of fairy tales with like metaphors, right? As opposed to events that actually happened. That's the impression I get. I do think the events of the Bible have happened, but a lot of his takeaways are actually very interesting, and it's a very fascinating way to look at the Bible, right? Because he treats it like a set of fairy tales, right? With like lessons of morals. So like Hansel and Gretel, uh, the Ugly Duckling, those kinds of stories. That's how he treats the Bible, and it was a fresh new perspective, and I decided to apply it, right? So he has this notion, right, based off the story of Moses. So Moses is in the desert, right? He's herding sheep, and something catches his attention, right? It is a burning bush. You've read the Bible, you know what story I'm talking about. The burning bush is eye-catching. It is impossible to miss, right? The bush isn't actually burning. It's on fire, but it's not like burning up. Which, sounds like a bit of a oxymoron, but that's how the Bible portrays it, right? And Moses approaches the bush, and that's when God speaks to him, right? So Jordan Peterson, right, made the observation that Moses followed what his attention was drawn to, right? What attracted him. And that's where he heard the voice of God. And that has worked beautifully for me. For years, I sat around waiting to hear God, right? I was expecting, he would appear on, his floating throne surrounded by cherubim, right? And he would speak forth and give me very clear and precise directions as to where I should go and what I should do, right? The problem with that line of thinking, as I iterated in my previous video, right, is that if he doesn't do that, you are left sitting around doing nothing, right? Waiting for a message that will never come. I bet you that message is already being transmitted, right? But not in the way you're expecting, which is why you're missing it. And the problem is that causes you to waste time, because if you're sitting around waiting for guidance and the guidance never comes, well, you're basically trapped in a rut, right? So my video is less a step-by-step instruction manual. It was meant to illustrate a new way of thinking that could potentially help people who felt stuck, right? Like, okay, you want to hear the voice of God, you're not hearing it. Have you tried this, right? This channel exists because I followed Dr. Peterson's principle, the story of Moses, okay? What drew my attention? What fascinated me? Men's issues, right? I can't even explain why. I just am, right? I'm really invested in helping other men, right? Because the modern day world is not kind to us, right? It really isn't. So I followed that, and that's where I found the voice of God. That's where I found this purpose, right? So Jordan Peterson's idea is that what draws your attention and what fascinates you and what you are truly passionate about, if pursued properly, that is equivalent to the voice of God, right? And I found that to be true in my own life, right? I have never felt closer to God, right, and closer to my purpose than when I am helping young men, right? And my roster has exploded recently. I must have like 10 different guys who I'm all talking with, right? God has blessed me, and I pray that I give out good advice. But that's why this video exists, because I wanted to clear some things up, okay? My original video on how to hear the voice of God is not definitive. It is not gospel truth, okay? It's another way of looking at things, okay? If you've been sitting around waiting for God to appear in a blaze of glory and he hasn't, maybe try this. Pursue your interest, right? take time in silence. For pursuing your interest in getting to know yourself are very closely intertwined, and I believe that those are the voice of God, right? So, in order to get to know yourself, you need the silence, right? Which is where the whole thing of like, oh, if you're always listening to music, shut it off, right? Because in the silence, that's where you find yourself, right? And that's how God speaks, right? God talks loudest in the silence, you know? And I don't think there's a difference between pursuing your passion, getting to know yourself, and the voice of God. But that is just what's worked personally for me, right? But again, it is not gospel truth, okay? So if you've been trying that and it hasn't worked, I'm sorry. Look elsewhere, pray about it, right? Um, the video was meant to exist as an alternate method, right? For those who were struggling. But I worry I may have presented it as the only way, right? And that's what I did with this guy, right? He obviously is in contact with God in a different way than I am, right? God speaks to him more clearly. So it would seem, right? And my mistake was I tried to shoehorn this man into my way of thinking, right? And because it's all I know, right? God again, God does not speak to me clearly, right? I have to work for it, right? And so that was all I knew. So therefore, I was like, oh, this guy's wrong. You should do it my way, right? That was hubristic, right? So this video exists to right that wrong, right? So the moral of the story is, don't put God in a box. God has many different ways of communicating, right? He communicates to me subtly and through grabbing my attention with certain things, right? But he doesn't outright speak to me, right? It is what it is, right? And I'm not like, you know, upset or anything, right? But I made the mistake of assuming that God spoke to everyone the same way he spoke to me, and that's clearly not the case. So yeah, don't put God in a box. He speaks to many different people in many different ways. My video should exist simply as a method for you to try to attempt to better hear his voice, right? That's all it is. So I want to admit when I'm wrong. I do. I don't want to be, just a run of the mill YouTuber, right? I want to admit when I'm wrong, and I want to rectify the mistake, right? If I can. I'm not going to take down the old video. There's a lot of good stuff in it, but if I presented it as the only way to hear God's voice, I'm very sorry. It's not. I've learned that today. So, yeah, that's all I got. I don't know when my next video will be. I have been struggling for my first several videos. I had like internal scripts already planned out, right? I knew what I wanted to say. My other video ideas, I don't have fleshed out scripts or even like many bullet points, right? So I want to flesh those videos out a little more. So I would say bear with me. I'm not going to have a consistent schedule. not for a while. So yeah, appreciate that you watched this video. Hope you learned something new from it. Sorry. And yeah, you guys have a blessed week.